Thank you for the invitation. And I understand you showed the Colbert clip a little while ago. Thank you for that. Thank you for setting very high expectations that I cannot meet. I'm not that funny, particularly with Stephen Colbert not next to me. A lot of you guys are third-year medical students. Is that right? Hands? Yep. How many of you have gotten more than 8 hours of sleep in the last month? Like a single night? Oh, really? Dudes, what's up? Aren't you guys like working these guys hard enough? I thought that was the whole point of third year. You know, they work, they get really tired. Anyway, well, I'm very honored to be here. Healthcare reform has been a long-time interest of mine, a passion of mine. And actually, I want to start by telling you a story, because I'm a journalist and that's what I know how to do. A story that actually was one of the first ones that got me started in thinking about healthcare reform and thinking about these issues. It's about a man named Gary Rotzler, who lives in upstate New York. And the story of Gary actually goes back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, when like you guys were in diapers or something, right? Is that, yeah, God, I feel old. Okay, anyway, early 1990s, Gary Rotzler, and Gary was living the American dream. He had married his high school sweetheart. They had settled down in this tiny little village at the foothills of the Catskill Mountains. They had 3 kids. They bought their first house. Gary had a college degree, and he was an engineer. And he worked for a defense contractor. Had a good, good-paying job with benefits. Everything was just going great. And then what happened to him was what happened to a lot of people who lived in upstate New York at that time. The recession hit, and at the same time, the United States was going through a lot of defense cutbacks because it was the end of the Cold War, and defense contractors were losing business. And Gary lost his job. Now, Gary was very industrious. He took his work ethic seriously. So he could have gone, just sort of gone on unemployment, but, he was really determined to kind of make his own way in the world. So he picked up part-time work. He worked in construction. He did odd jobs around there. And his wife, Betsy, she opened a daycare center in their home. And they would sit, and they got by. They had enough money to pay the rent. They had enough money to feed the kids and get, new clothes for them for school. And that was great. The one thing they could not get was health insurance, which is pretty common. They didn't have the money for it. They couldn't find it on the open market. They couldn't find a plan that would cover what they needed. So they were uninsured, which again was fairly common. And this went on for a while. And they kept thinking, well, eventually, Gary kept applying for jobs. Eventually he would find work and he would get insurance. And he kept trying. We couldn't find one. So they went. This went on for about 2 years. At some point, Betsy started feeling some fatigue. She started feeling some backaches. Something was clearly wrong. She didn't want to go to the doctor. She was worried about the medical bills. At one point, their daughter had broken her ankle, gone to the emergency room. They owed $1,000 just for the x-ray and for resetting the ankle. And, they knew that this could be very expensive. They didn't want to spend money they didn't have to. They wanted to keep money in reserve for a real crisis. So they just kind of got by. Eventually, Gary got a job actually at his old employer. The defense contractor started hiring back workers. But the defense contractor this time was hiring back their workers as independent contractors. So he had the same job basically, he was working the same hours as before, only now he didn't have health benefits. But they said, look, you work for a while, you keep going, eventually, hopefully we'll be able to get you benefits. This went on, and Betsy was feeling worse and worse and worse, and finally they said, look, this has gotten too bad, we need to figure out what's going on. They found a clinic that was giving free exams. They went there, and doctor took about 10 minutes of sort of talking to her and doing an exam and figured out that she had breast cancer. And in fact, she had it for a while and had advanced to a very advanced stage. And at that point, they got her in the hospital. They went to Sloan Kettering. It was too late, and 3 months later, she died. Now, I'm not here to tell you that if Betsy Rotzler had gotten preventative care, she had seen the doctor as soon as she started feeling well, that she'd be alive today. She was young. She had breast cancer. It was obviously a very aggressive form of the disease. But do we think that if she'd gotten the care, she might have been able to live longer, had more time with her 3 kids and less pain? Yeah, I think so. And one thing I know for sure is that after Betsy died, the bills started coming to Gary Rotzler. The bills for the funeral, the bills for the medical care, $50,000 from Sloan Kettering that he couldn't pay. And so after he was done burying his wife, and after he was done figuring out how he was going to take care of his kids, he had to file for bankruptcy. And you ask yourself, did that have to happen? I mean, here's a guy who, to use the famous phrase, he was playing by the rules. He was doing all the right things. His wife was playing by the rules. They were trying to make their way in America. They were trying to work, trying to do what we all do. And they got some bad luck, and they suffered for it. Well, that's where the story began for me, saying, do we have to have a system like this? And actually, it's an old story in this country. For more than 100 years, people have been asking that question. And a couple of years ago, we elected a new president. We had a big debate in Congress, and I was fortunate, as Mark says, I was fortunate. I was able to watch this develop in real time, and after this long, grueling legislative fight, I was actually in the House chamber the day they voted to pass the Affordable Care Act. 3 days later, I was at the White House. I was in the East Room. I got to see President Obama sign that legislation. I remember thinking as this was all done, wow, I've just seen history happen. And you know, I knew the law wasn't that popular necessarily. I knew that a lot of people thought the Democrats shouldn't have spent so much time on it. But I also thought, well, look, that episode is over. The law is passed. We're done. And now we can move on to implementing this law and trying to make it work as well as it can. Obviously, I was wrong about that. In fact, we stand here today, and there's a very good chance that 6 months from now, the Affordable Care Act will not be the law of the land, or at least not entirely. It faces a political challenge. The likely Republican nominee for president has said his very first act as president will be to repeal the law. That, by the way, is based on the law he passed in Massachusetts, but we won't talk about that. The Republican Party in Congress has pledged to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And if you don't take that threat seriously, keep in mind that the House of Representatives has already voted to do just that. So I do think they'll try. And that all assumes that we even have a law to repeal in 6 months. Because as you may have noticed, you may have heard, Mark mentioned, the Supreme Court has taken a case on whether the law is constitutional. And a couple of months ago, I would have told you that, according to most legal experts, the law is constitutional, and there's a very, very small chance that the Supreme Court would actually overturn it. Well, I spent 3 days at the Supreme Court watching oral arguments, and let me tell you something. They may overturn it. They may overturn part of it. They may decide that the individual mandate is unconstitutional. They may throw out the whole law. It would be the most audacious act of judicial review of overruling democratically elected federal legislature since at least the early 20th century. Something that I think most of us thought just could not happen, at least not on this case. But now it looks like it could happen. There's a decent chance of that. So, with the rest of my time here, what I want to do is I want to tell you why I think we should keep this law. The rationale behind it, how we came to pass this not perfect, not ideal, but very workable and very good piece of legislation, and why I hope it will not just survive the election, but also survive the Supreme Court challenge. And I should say, let me just get a little, just to get a sense of how much you guys know here. How many of you are sort of, consider yourself familiar with the basics of the Affordable Care Act? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you know what an insurance exchange is? How many of you know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid? Okay, good. All right. You know, you got to check these things. You don't want to go like too high a level. If you want to understand the history of healthcare reform, you actually have to understand the history of medicine. And you guys may know this, may not, but modern medicine as we know it didn't really exist until the early 20th century. You know, before that period, the saying was if you went to the doctor, if you had an illness, basically your chances of actually getting better were no greater than 50-50. You guys in the white coats, it's better than that now, right? Modestly better, at least? Somewhat better? Hope so. And actually hospitals, if you look at the hospitals that were built, I don't know how old this, how old is this? This is...
the 1940s.
Okay, it's not that old. But I know some of the hospitals in Chicago, they date back, you know, more than 100 years. You know, when they were originally founded, it was mostly religious orders coming to the United States, basically to build places where people could get sick and die, and make sure that you could sort of be cared for in comfort with people who spoke your language and if you were going to pass on that, you could have your last rites delivered in the proper faith. That's why you have so many religious hospitals, actually. But early 20th century thereabouts, very roughly speaking, there's sort of a revolution in medicine. And among the biggest advances are the sort of development and understanding of anesthesia, and understanding of the sanitary techniques, so you can not give people infections. And suddenly, for the first time, you can really do surgery, and you can actually cure a lot of these problems. You can actually make people better. And so we have this explosion in the early 20th century of hospitals where they're doing appendectomies and tonsillectomies and all kinds of ectomies. And for the first time, medicine as we know it is actually, succeeding. But of course, as healthcare gets better, as medicine becomes more technologically advanced, it starts to become more expensive. You have to build the facilities, you have to buy the equipment, you have to train the professionals like you guys. All that costs money. You guys know that. You're paying tuition. You know how much it costs. It actually costs a lot even back then, not as much as it costs today. And for the first time, people now are facing a situation where getting sick, your financial concern about getting sick isn't just that you're going to miss work. That's what it was before. If you got sick, your big worry was, oh, I'm going to get sick. I'm going to miss 3 weeks of work. I'm going to be out salary. Well, now for the first time, people are worried, I'm going to get sick. I'm going to have to go to the doctor. I'm going to have to go to the hospital, and I can't pay the bill. What am I going to do about this? Late 1920s, a bunch of foundations got together and started a study. They formed something called the Committee on the Cost of Medical Care. And they conducted what was really the first comprehensive survey of healthcare and healthcare spending in the United States. And the timing was fairly fortuitous because the Great Depression hit right after they started their work. So suddenly they had a really kind of large sample to work with. They could see lots of people who were struggling. And they started to figure out what was going on. And one of the interesting things, if you're a history buff and you have the time, and there's probably a copy in the library somewhere, you can actually go back and read these reports. It's quite amazing because the stories you read from back then are just like the stories you read from today. People are getting sick, they can't pay their bills. They're going bankrupt. They're foregoing care. Bad things are happening. Some of them are lucky enough to get charity care, but most of them aren't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting was they sort of figured out there was an interesting economy underneath this pattern they started to observe. On the one hand, they found that people who got sick, the vast majority of them, if they had to go to the hospital, individually, most people could not afford it. So if you got a heart attack, you broke your leg, you had to go to the hospital, the bills were going to come and it was more than you could pay. But overall, they found that the overall burden of healthcare was something that was not that great a burden on society. And actually back then it was really low. It was like 2 or 3% of GDP. And they discovered they kind of happened across what I sort of liken to the E equals MC squared of healthcare economics, which is what's called the 80-20 rule. Anyone know what the 80-20 rule is? Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. If you are wearing yellow, raise your hand. Yellow shirt, yellow pants. I got to be able to see that. Raise your hand. Yellow works. Okay, so that's roughly, generously speaking, about a fifth of you. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up if you have the yellow. Okay, I'm going to give you guys with yellow a disease. You guys have Loyola-itis. Very rare disease for students of Loyola Medical School. And you guys are in trouble. You're going to go to the hospital and you're going to spend weeks there and up these huge medical bills. And everyone else in the room is healthy. Congratulations. You're not sick. You're lucky. Now here's the thing. You didn't know when you woke up this morning that I was going to pick you out for having a yellow shirt being one of the sick people, right? And this was sort of a random event. Well, this is pretty much the way the healthcare economy works. At any one time, a fifth of the people, roughly, are the ones with most of the medical bills. They're the people with the serious medical conditions. They're the ones with chronic disease. They are dealing with serious accidents. They're the people in the hospitals. They're the ones running up these big bills. And the other 80% are people who they have routine stuff. Maybe they get a sore throat. Maybe, they get an abrasion. They have to go to the doctor, but nothing too serious. So, for the 80% of people, medical expenses aren't a big deal. For that 20% of people, though, it's a big, crushing burden. So how do you fix that? Well, you say, you know what? And since any one of us in the 80% could become the 20%, you could get sick, you could get hit by a car, you could get cancer, you could get a heart attack. It makes sense for all of us to pool our resources. Because if we all pay into this one pool, then there will be enough money to cover the bills for the people who are sick. That's the 80-20 rule. Just get that to work. And this is basically the concept of health insurance.